As much as I love the library for the original Switch, the power level the system had definitely held it back from certain multi-platform releases finding their way there. There were some teams that absolutely found a way to make a version of the game work on the Switch, and wasn't always the best looking version of it, but was a viable way to play it. But now that we have the Switch 2, which is a significantly more powerful system, we're already beginning to see a deluge of multiple games making their way finally over to Nintendo platforms. But there's still quite a few left that I would love to see added, so I wanted to go over a bunch of games that have not made their way to the Switch yet, that I would love to see be made available on the Switch 2. And while I do think most of these games actually do have a pretty good chance of making their way over sometime soon, possibly even this year, I do want to start with a game that I think has a pretty high chance, and that's Metaphor ReFantazio. This is of course the new, not Persona game that came out from the Persona team, taking place in a fantasy setting. It released a year ago. In fact, they just celebrated their 1-year anniversary, and I was actually very surprised that as part of them doing a live stream celebrating the 1-year anniversary, a Switch 2 port was not one of the things they talked about. Sega in general is one of those companies where there's been a pretty heavy push in putting their games on as many platforms as possible lately. For instance, Persona 3 Reload is about to come out on the system. They've announced a bunch of the older Yakuza games making their way to the system. And because of the fact that, specifically, Persona 3 Reload being a game that can run on the Switch 2, Metaphor ReFantazio is just something that makes a ton of sense. RPGs in general are a genre that I think just flourish really well on handhelds, and it's no mistake that quite a few games on this list are RPGs. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. And Metaphor in particular, using the calendar system that's been really made popular by the Persona games, is just a style that I think works really well where you can just lay back and play it in handheld mode, especially if you're just trying to get through the days. If you're doing a more serious dungeon push, I can see kind of a go time, more proper dock TV setup, but for the day-to-day living, handheld feels like a perfect fit. If I had to pick any single game from this list that I think has a 100% chance of making its way to the Switch 2 at some point, it's this one. And frankly, I'm just kind of surprised it hasn't actually been announced yet. My best guess is that because they are bringing Persona 3 Reload over, there's maybe a bit of a pacing choice here where they don't want to bring out a ton of games all at once. They want to put maybe a month or so between them. So with that game coming out, maybe, just maybe, we'll get an announcement sometime in the near future. Next up, let's just jump right away into another RPG with Baldur's Gate 3. This should not be a particularly controversial choice in terms of just a popular game that people would like to have on more platforms. I will say, back when the Switch 2 hadn't released yet and we were still theorizing a little bit about its potential power level, this was a game I would talk about as being one where I wasn't quite as sure we'd be seeing it get a port at some point, just because it is a little bit more demanding. Honestly, seeing how well the Switch 2 performs and now seeing how much they've been able to optimize this game for certain platforms, we now have it up and running better on the Xbox Series S. They now have a actual Steam Deck native version that is targeted at getting the best performance out of that handheld. And if we're getting a version for Steam Deck that's running as well as it is, I don't really see a reason why that shouldn't be possible on the Switch 2 as well. It's not necessarily going to be the absolute best looking version of the game to play, but I do think it absolutely falls under the window of something that could be viably playable on the system. And again, this is one of those kind of games where I think handheld is just a bit of a boon. I've actually spent most of my time playing Baldur's Gate 3 on a PC handheld. It was an experience that just felt very appropriate. And particularly for Baldur's Gate 3, one thing I do want to shout out is that I don't really love gamepad controls for a lot of these isometric RPGs. I tend to find keyboard and mouse to be a lot more comfortable, but Larian did a great job with their gamepad style controls for this game. And so translating that over to the Switch and maybe even still supporting something similar to KBM mode by taking advantage of the Switch 2 mouse controls is just something that I think would be a fantastic fit, provided they get it running just the right way on the system. A little bit more hectic on performance, but again, I think if they can get a Steam Deck native version running as well as they are now, Switch 2 can work. Okay, there's one more RPG I want to talk about, and then I'm going to take a break. There will be other genres to talk about, but this isn't actually one single game. This is a whole series, and technically one that did find its way to the Switch, but not really, and I think it does need a proper release for the Switch 2. The Kingdom Hearts collection. Look, Kingdom Hearts is one of those franchises, love it or hate it. There's a library of fantastic games that thankfully they've released as one huge collection that you can just play start to finish. Honestly, as far as great deals go for the amount of game per dollar, this collection is one of the better ones out there. And it was released on the regular Switch as an online streaming only version, which was frustrating at the time in the first place, but now that the Switch 2 is an option and is, again, a lot more powerful than the regular Switch, not a lot of reasons why this collection couldn't actually run native on this platform. And again, handheld I think is something that is just such a great fit for a game like this. Some of the titles in this collection were originally handheld games in the first place, a couple of which were Nintendo platforms as well. And especially with Kingdom Hearts 4 coming out sometime in the near future, far future, I don't even know at this point. They've just kind of been lightly talking about it here and there as the years have gone by. But assuming that game is on its way sometime in the next couple years, having that full collection made available on as many platforms as possible, which, you know, they've got most of them at this point, but having a truly native version for Switch 2, I think would be a great fit, especially if they ever drop any new news for 4 and give people a way to be like, hey, by the way, if you want to catch up or replay anything, here's this new option. Okay, let's take a break from RPGs and swap on over to a genre that I think is honestly most at home on Nintendo in general, platformers. In particular, Psychonauts 2. This is, I think, one of the most underappreciated games that has come out in the past decade. It was actually my personal game of the year back in 2021. Just a truly phenomenal, wonderful 3D platformer. It's actually one of the games that immediately comes to my mind when people talk about how, like, Astrobot was this great 3D platformer and we haven't had a good one in forever. And it's like, Psychonauts 2 is right there. Astrobot's great too. This isn't about Astrobot not being good, but so many people I think put emphasis on that, like we just have no other great options. And it's like, this is a wonderful game that clearly a lot of people are still sleeping on. What I find really weird about this too, by the way, is that the original Psychonauts also never made its way over to the Switch, which, you know, that originally came out on the original Xbox, so seems like a game the original Switch should have been able to handle. And so I do wonder if maybe, you know, Xbox has begun trying to push more of their own published titles going out to more platforms. They've already released a couple games on Nintendo Switch, and so there's a part of me that really hopes to see some kind of bundle collection come out where 1 and 2 are just released simultaneously for the Switch too. They could be, you know, sold separately as well as an option, but I think putting both these games on the Switch just makes a lot of sense. Nintendo in general just has such strong platforming DNA. I think it's probably the one genre that's the most closely associated with them, and this would be a wonderful addition to the library and a great way for more people to discover this game that I think, again, just hasn't really gotten the proper attention it deserves. Next game, bit of a tone shift, but let's talk FromSoft. We already know that FromSoft is showing some support for Switch 2 right out the gate. Elden Ring is on its way very soon coming to the platform. They've also already announced an original game that is going to be at least a timed exclusive, if not permanently exclusive, called The Duskbloods. And of course, there are a bunch of other games FromSoft has already made that did not make their way to the original Switch that the Switch 2 can now handle. There's a couple I think people can already think of off the top of their head they would like to see, but the one personally I'm going to shout out, Armored Core 6. I absolutely love the Armored Core franchise. It's had its ups and downs, and it's always been a little bit of a specific niche audience, one that I happen to be a part of. And mech building is just such a fun activity to me, and it's one that I think actually works really well in a handheld format, because especially if I just want to like kick back and look at all my different options and fine-tune my mech a little more, handheld feels like a really great choice for that. And something that we've already seen happen in the past. There's been other mech games released on the original Switch and now the Switch 2, like Daemon X Machina. It's a genre I think we already can see works on the platform, and Armored Core is just the franchise that comes to my mind when I think of the mech genre. Another action game franchise that I absolutely love and has not seen its later games make its way over to the Switch just yet, Devil May Cry. In particular, I'm thinking 5. 4 would be great to see come over there as well, but we already have the collection of the older PS2 games, the Devil May Cry 1, 2, and 3 on the original Switch, and seeing 4 and especially 5 make their way over to the Switch 2 would be wonderful. Capcom is another one of those companies right now where I think they are really leaning heavier and heavier into multi-plat and wanting to just put their games on as many places as they can. They're already in the midst of porting over a bunch of their other big demanding games over, like a bunch of the more recent Resident Evil titles, and so I feel like Devil May Cry is something that's just around the corner. It's also just been a healthy bit of time since 5 dropped, and I'm really hoping we get some new news on a proper 6 or just some other title within the franchise coming out in the near future. And one way to help build up a little bit more hype for that would be to bring 5 over to a new platform and maybe just add a couple little fun new things to celebrate it getting a new release. Okay, so I do want to go back to RPGs, but these are some more action RPG focused ones, starting with the Mass Effect Legacy Edition. This was a re-release of the full Mass Effect trilogy. 1 in particular got some more heavy reworks to bring it a little bit more in line with the action focus that 2 and 3 had, and it is just honestly, I think one of the start to finish best trilogies in gaming that's ever been made. Yeah, there's some problems with 3 in the ending. Probably wasn't as good as it could have been, but the ride up until then is still fantastic, especially with all the later DLC stories that were added on. The Citadel in particular is absolutely hilarious, and I think one of the best fan-focused celebrations of a franchise near its end. Point is, Wonderful games. Came out on Xbox and PlayStation a couple of years back, and made sense why it didn't make its way over to the Switch at that time, but I think it makes a lot of sense to bring it over to the Switch 2 now. I think part of this is that not only is there a performance thing going on, but EA in general has not been the most supportive company of Nintendo, but I think that's beginning to change a little bit, especially with how successful the Switch was, and I would love to see this be one of the games that ends up making its way over. I do want to shout out, by the way, that as much as I do want to see this make its way to the Switch, this is one of those games where it goes on sale consistently enough on Steam for a price that to me is completely mind-boggling, but if you have never actually had the chance to play this series before, it goes on sale for like $5 fairly regularly with every major Steam sale. Pick it up if you have a system that can run it. It is, I think, quite possibly the single best return of investment for a game you could ever spend. $5 for 3 of, I think, again, one of the strongest trilogies in gaming history. Absolutely fantastic. Play them. And then going back over to a bit more JRPG vibes, Tales of Arise. The Tales franchise is one that in general has been showing a lot of support for Nintendo. They've been doing a bunch of remasters of their kind of PS2 era on games and bringing them to more and more platforms, Switch being one of them. And Arise was their latest actual brand new title. It's been out for a little while now, but it makes sense for when that game released that, you know, it was a bit too demanding for the original Switch. I don't see that really being the case for the Switch 2, and I think it'd be wonderful to see it make its way over. And in fact, actually, one other game I do want to shout out in the franchise that would be great to see come out on the Switch 2 that did get released on the Switch, just re-release Tales of Symphonia again and actually fix it. The Symphonia release for the original Switch was not great. It had a lot of buggy issues. The frame rate was not really as good as it could have been. There were just all kinds of problems. And a lot of the remasters of Tales games that have come out since that have actually done pretty well on the Switch, quite a bit better. And so it just feels like Symphonia is a little bit of a stain that could be cleaned up and fixed. Bring out a newer, fixed up version of that, put it on the Switch 2. Would love to see that happen as well. There's a couple more games I do want to shout out real quick, and these are a little different from the others because while a lot of these games I've been talked about are ones that I get why they didn't come out of the original Switch because of just whatever sacrifices they'd have to make the performance as smooth as they can. There's a couple games that just never made their way to the Switch, and doesn't really make sense to me why they didn't, and I'd like to see them still happen at some point, whether for that or for the Switch 2. One of them I've been thinking about a lot lately, Pyre. This has been on my mind because Hades 2 is now out on the Switch 2. In fact, it's even a timed exclusive for the platform before it makes its way over to PlayStation and Xbox. And Pyre is a game from Supergiant Games that I think is a bit of the least represented, and I get why. It's a bit more of a specific game than their others. While a lot of other titles they make are action games, it is a visual novel fantasy sports game that is such a unique experience. I think one of the things that's really neat about it to me is its method of storytelling, where win or lose matches, the story continues on forward, and there are going to be some situations where losing a particular major match might actually be something you want to have happen for plot reasons I don't really want to get into and spoil, but it really is such a singularly interesting game that is by far, I think, Supergiant's most experimental title, and one that I would love more people to give a chance, especially with how much their fandom has grown with the success of Hades and Hades 2. Seeing this game get a fresh re-release for a major platform like Switch 2, I think would go a long way. It released originally on the PS4, it does have a PC release as well, and it just has not made its way to anywhere else since then, so I would love to see that change. Another game that released on PS4 and has been trapped there, and I am a little frustrated hasn't made its way to Switch for honestly kind of a personally selfish reason, which is I would love a physical copy to complete my lineup. Castlevania Requiem. This is a pair of Castlevania games, two of the best ones to be honest, which are Symphony of the Night and Rondo of Blood. Konami has been re-releasing so many classic Castlevania games, and they've put them on as many platforms as they can, but that collection in particular was one of the earlier ones they did, and for whatever reason, it has stayed trapped specifically to PS4. The later Game Boy Advance game collection made its way to everything, the DS games, the Dominus collection made its way to everything, they have the classic ones, but specifically, Symphony of the Night and Rondo of Blood in this collection has been trapped on PS4, and while I do have that digitally and like having the availability there, I would love to have a physical copy to just give me a nice, perfect, full lineup of the entirety of classic Castlevania all in one physical collection. So those are a bunch of games that I would love to see make their way over to the Switch too. That's really only scratching the surface, to be honest. There are so many more games I could talk about that I just wasn't able to get to. A whole bunch of fighting games that I think would be great on the system that have not made their way over just yet, because the Switch in particular didn't really get a lot of major fighting game releases. Older ports of stuff, we're still waiting on certain classics like Chrono Trigger to make their way over. I just wanted to focus on some of the more recent titles that haven't came over. But let me know down below in the comments, what games would you love to see make their way over to the Switch 2 that haven't yet, either because the original Switch just couldn't handle it, or it just has been stuck on another platform for one reason or another. Let me know down below. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you all later.